Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocker Selberg, and I co-host Lounge together with Barbara Frontera and Tiani Jones. Today, we welcome Eb Ikonne to the Complexity Lounge. Eb has a 27-year career in product development, where he's held several roles ranging from software engineer to CTO. He is currently the AVP of Product Engineering at Cox Automotive and has a deep understanding of the complex challenges facing leaders in the area of product development et al. In today's talk, Eb will discuss how we can adopt complexity thinking, why it matters, and what we can all do to help organizations adapt under conditions of uncertainty. As always, we'll have lots of times for your questions and comments. So, Eb, welcome to the lounge.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Jaco, Barbara, Tiani, and everybody who's on for joining. This won't happen if you're not here. So thank you for making out some time in your day. So I've got a slide to share. Let's see if this still works for me. Can you see my slide? Yes, you can. Okay, so we're here and you've all gotten the introduction and we'll go through it together. Feel free. So uh, I'm told this is the lounge, at least the complexity lounge. And so I thought to myself, well, what is a lounge? And a lounge is a public room in a hotel, theater, or club in which to sit and relax. Clearly, the writers of the dictionary have failed to update the definition given the times we live in. But this is a virtual lounge, and so I'm here in a lounge kind of attire. I am of Nigerian heritage. If the first slide didn't tell you that, well, now you know. And so I normally stand up and talk and do all these kinds of things, but I said, hey, since we're in the lounge, we're gonna sit and relax and have a conversation as we go along today. So it's going to be hopefully free flowing. I always cringe when people say deep expertise because I always wonder what is deep and how deep is deep enough. But we'll go together and talk and share ideas and thoughts. So here's the deal. I'm interested in complexity thinking for all. And I said for all because a little bit about me is I have a terminal degree in strategic leadership and organizational design. So I'm passionate about all those things when it comes to leadership and whatnot. And I've looked extensively at leadership and complexity thinking and how those things come together and how leaders need to, for example, can, or maybe not how, but how they can use complexity thinking in the way they lead in the organizations. But I found out, or my experience seems to be, that the conversation tends to stop there, not because people don't believe that everybody in the organization will benefit from adopting this. It just seems that there's an inordinate amount of focus on those with significant authority in the org. In fact, I recently did a Google search on Scholar, and if you search for leader or leadership and complexity, you get a gazillion results with leader and complexity and things like that in the title of the article. But if you search for complexity with any other thing that is not leader, whether it's employee or participant or just something that's more general, it's really slim pickings. And it's interesting to me that this is the case. And so one of the things I'm passionate about is how do we take this thinking beyond our leaders, who, of course, because they set conditions and put constraints in place, whether they're enabling or governing or whatever they may be. But how do we take this to everybody? Because I think it matters. So that's what I want to spend some time talking with all of you about today. So what is complexity thinking? Well, this is a lounge, so I'm sure there are a ton of answers here, but as a bit of an academic myself, I think it's always important to start off with some definitions to ground people so people know where I'm coming from and the way I'm approaching the topic. So Three definitions for your contemplation today as we go forward. So, one, it's a type of thinking that results from appreciating that our organizations are and consist of complex systems. So it's not that your in its entirety is a complex system, which is true. It's that in your organization you have complex systems as well. You might consider a team a complex system. You might consider a department in the organization a complex system. But complexity thinking for me is about appreciating this fact, or at least appreciating this way of thinking about the way things are. The second definition I'll throw out here is that it's the type of thinking that results from embracing. And you might notice that I'm using some words with positive effect in my definitions here because I think it's important the way you handle this. So embracing that we cannot know everything about organizations, yet we have the capacity to influence, affect, steer the organization to some degree. And I use organization loosely here. Like organization might not be your entire organization per se. It might be the team that you're part of or the department that you belong to. But it's that unit that you can influence in one way or the other. And so the last definition I'll share comes from Kurt Richardson, an article he wrote in 2008. Complexity thinking is the art of maintaining the tension between pretending we know something and knowing we know nothing for sure. So it's this tension. I'm told there are words you're not supposed to say in the lounge. One of the words I heard was liminal. But excuse me as I say it right now, right? So it's in this in-betweenness, if you will. Maybe that's a better way. Like, yeah, why do we have to say liminal? Why don't we just say in-betweenness? And you'll see this comes out as I talk. Like one of the reasons why maybe I'm giving away spoilers, but hey, we're in the lounge, so this conversation can go in any which way I decide it's going to go today. But in betweenness might be a better word than liminal in casual conversation. And I think part of the challenge with the complexity community is that our language can be off-putting to people who don't have the time to really sit down and reflect on uncertain things. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but I think that's really important when we think about complexity for all. So it's in the in-betweenness of, or being in this space of tension between pretending we know something. And you might say, well, pretending is too strong a word. Maybe, maybe not. And knowing we know something, nothing for sure. So it's this constant state of doubt. It's not doubt that cripples, though, or paralyzes. It's doubt that enables us to act with a tremendous amount of humility because we are not sure that we are reading the situation right. Neither are we sure of what's going to happen when we move forward. And this is important because complexity thinking is not about a particular tool or method or even a particular language, if I may offer. It's really about our attitude towards the world and how we engage in the world and with the world as a result of this attitude. All right. So, uh, many of you probably know Cilliers and sort of his description of a complex system. You may or may not agree with this in full. I'm not going to read every single bullet point here, but I just want to give us a sense of when we talk about complexity thinking, the attitude that we mentioned previously, and the fact that we see the world we inhabit, we see the organizations we inhabit, we see the units and structures we inhabit, excuse me, as potentially being complex, then what does that mean? And so this is where we begin to see some or all of these characteristics that Paul Cilliers outlined in that famous paper, I think it was in Emergence, that talks about what we see with complex system, whether the presence of feedback loops, the presence of the property of having a memory, the fact that the behavior of the system is determined That's a strong word, but it's determined by the nature of the interactions, not just the interactions, but the nature, the quality, the type of interaction, and that these interactions lead to nonlinear behavior in the system. So that's the kind of situation we're talking about. And so when we take an attitude of complexity thinking, we approach the world with some of this in ourselves and how we act. And so this hopefully, well, if this is your first time hearing about complexity, then maybe this is brand new to you. But if not, this is sort of setting the ground or setting the foundations for how we proceed and move forward. Because what we're saying when we think about taking complexity thinking to the organization more broadly, and again, organization representing the scope where you have influence and where you do work, this is what you're really trying to do. You're trying to get people to appreciate this situation, that they belong to a system where there are many interacting parts that are leading to results that cannot be predicted ahead of time. We don't know what's necessarily going to happen. And you want to help people adopt that in a world where we appreciate order and determinism and having it all figured out ahead of time. This is what we're trying to do as we go forward. So there's a bit of a warning here because this is the lounge, and I know the lounge has been operating for a few years now. So if you came here with the expectation that I'm going to get like uber technical about complexity, like I'm going to talk about attractors and dissipative structures and self-organization and emergence and yada yada yada, I'm sorry, I'm just going to disappoint you. So I just give the disclaimer right now. So I've taken only 14 minutes of your time. And so if at this point you're like, well, I wanted to hear about all these technical terms, just telling you up front, that's not what today is going to be about. And so you can, if your expectation was one thing, I've taken only 14 minutes of your time. I give you the remainder of this 2 hours back. That's my gift to you. Otherwise, join me on this ride as we talk about how we can make complexity thinking attractive and something people want to talk. And I see Barbara just like leaning forward. So I'll yield. You've got something you want to share with the group?
No, I have to lean forward to read the chat because I can't see very well. So
Oh, I'd love to hear if there's something, if people are already sending me zingers on the chat. I'd love that.
no, I mean that I've mostly been putting in links, but Yulia is looking forward to the complexity speakeasy. Um, and my only comment was the yada 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 of complexity. I am dead.
Who's to say the speakeasy doesn't already exist? So,
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So there's your fair warning. Again, if you came really wanting to satisfy your hunger to talk about attractors and tags and all these things, then I'm sorry to disappoint you. But I was nice. I told you up front, and now you can make a decision. And that's what it means to be part of a complex system. All interactions here. Okay. So who benefits from complexity thinking? And I think the answer for me is we all do. Everybody does. Even those people who don't want to adopt it, they benefit from it because when others are acting in certain ways, it benefits them. And so whether we like it or not, we're all acting in and on complex systems. That's no choice as I see the world. That's just matter of fact, state of affairs. We are in and acting on complex systems. And that's something that's important to always, I think, remember. That being said, not every situation within a complex system is complex. Not every situation within a complex system is necessarily complex. And so this is part of the beauty of complexity thinking as well, is recognizing this and trying to adjust how we act based on the situation. Now, I think a big challenge is we're acting in complex systems and on complex systems. Often people don't recognize this fact. And because of that, they miss a whole um, space of opportunity, if you will. And then even within the complex system, people don't recognize that the situations they're facing or we're facing together are complex. And so they treat everything as potentially a simple problem. If I'm just going to use a very binary, I know there are different frameworks that kind of try to map out the nature of our situations or our problems, whether it's Cynefin or you think about HiFed's technical versus adaptive challenges, or some of the other things that other people have just written about how you can look at the world and kind of categorize your situation, your challenge, your problem. For the most part, we approach the world as if it's a set of simple or maybe even complicated problems that can be solved by reductionist type approaches. And so the complexity thinker, if I can use that term, has to caution themselves and guard themselves against going the other extreme and thinking that everything in their complex world is complex just because they're in a complex system. This may not be the case. In fact, it's very rarely the case. We have a great number of varied types of situations that we all have to deal with. And so, why does complexity thinking matter for all? And I've shared this, one of my most favorite quotes from Max Planck. I think he's also famed for saying something to the effect that science progresses or something progresses, uh, the death of one scientist at a time, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing there. But he says, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Uh, the fact of the matter is, we act in the world based on the way we see things. We just do. And so it's very difficult to uh, act differently. And I'll talk a little bit about this consistently if you don't change the way you're looking at things. Now, I can make you or challenge you or have you act differently for a time being. But if that action, Pascal and others have said, like, we're more likely to act our way into new thinking than think our way into new acting. And that's an important thing to remember. It also means that we can think our way into new acting. People often forget that part and try to say we must always behave our way into new thinking, but you can think your way into new behavior. But that's not the point here. The point I'm really trying to make here is that until we truly change the way we think, the way we act is not going to be permanent. And so it's important that we change the way we look at things. And then because we've changed the way we look at things, the things we're looking at change. The situation takes on a new shape, a new dimension. It no longer looks the same way that it has in the past. And this is important in an organizational in an organizational construct because it impacts how we face our challenges. And it's not a laundry list of the reasons why it matters. But when I think about the top reasons why it matters for us, or for me more specifically, is we expect a number of people in our organizations to do things, to make decisions, to solve problems. A number of our problems are best solved if we all work on it together. But until we adopt complexity thinking, we won't approach the world in this way. We still will have people who think they can sit in an ivory tower and come up with a solution that's going to work for everybody in every given situation. Many decisions made in organizations are as a result of thinking about the world as if it's a machine, as we all know. And so if I just replace this part, the machine works better. There's an appreciation for the nature of the interactions, the nonlinear behavior that we see just doesn't exist. And so complexity thinking matters if we're going to get different behavior in an organization, if we're going to get people at all levels to make certain decisions in certain ways, we need to introduce this way of thinking to them. And I just fundamentally believe that our ability to deal with complexity affects our flourishing. And so I think a lot of responses in organizations that lead to disengagement, that lead to just disconnection, are a result of maladaptive responses to challenges in the organization. If people had taken on a complexity thinking type of approach, the response would be different. But because they haven't, the response is maladaptive. It's not where it should be. And it has consequences for everybody else because now we're disgruntled, we're not happy. We know that the solution doesn't work. Now, often people say to me, like, yeah, but we still made revenue this year. We still made budget this year. We still achieved the things we needed to achieve. So why all this talk? So I grew up in Nigeria. At least I spent some formative years growing up in Nigeria. And one of the interesting phenomenons of growing up in a country where there's a lot of agriculture and farming, my context, so I didn't grow up in a city. I grew up in a rural area where we did a lot of farming. It is not uncommon to see a tree that's showing signs of death even produce the occasional good fruit. And I think that we often deal with a lot of that, which is we are successful despite ourselves. And I even often suggest to people that the reason why we're able to be successful is because our systems are complex, and complex systems are actually quite resilient. They overcome our stupidity, is another way to think about it. And so they find ways, we're part of these systems that find ways of delivering results despite our poor acting within them. So it's not simply enough to just look at did we deliver on time or did we hit our numbers and just conclude that the way we're approaching the world is a productive way. We need to take the time to really look at the way we're going about doing things. What were the decisions that were made? How well did they work or did not work? How are people experiencing themselves within the system? Could we have done that quicker? Could we have saved ourselves significant pain if we had approached it differently? So these are the reasons why I believe complexity thinking is important for us to adopt, and not just the managerial leadership or those with the most authority or highest positions in the org, but everybody needs to begin to adopt this. So it sounds like to me that the general pattern for the lounge is for the presentation to conclude and there to be discussion and questions. But I actually want to challenge that general pattern because that's just the way I operate. And I want to yield, and I'll ask my host to be gracious and maybe time boxes. But I'm curious to get like immediate feedback, immediate thoughts in this moment on complexity thinking, why it matters for everybody to sort of adopt this attitude. So if my hosts accept my request here, I'll open it up.
You're in the driver's seat.
I love
So
that.
we're good to go. If you could stop sharing your screen right now so that we can just see, so I can see if anybody wants to talk, because right now all I can see is a bunch of little boxes. Okay, so what do we got? I think Randall had his hand up first. So
Okay,
Randall.
thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. Trying out some new buds. Quick question for you, and it gets back to this, and I appreciate you bringing up high fits and, technical versus adaptive. The thing that I always struggle with as a practitioner is that gets back to your earlier comment that organizations themselves are complex adaptive systems, but within that, sort of macro CAS, you've got all these sort of micro CASs all over the place. Ad hoc teams, functions, departments, just kind of like how you laid it out. The thing that I struggle with is sort of this reconciliation of technical work and adaptive work being part of the same sort of issue that you're trying to resolve. So, much of my work in organizations is trying to, let's say, re-engineer an end-to-end process, order to cash, hire to retire, procure to pay. And so, in any sort of large grain process like that, you've got complexities that are adaptive. You've got complexities that are more of a technical nature. It could be a process, for example, on, building a truck. And it's, and the company's built the truck a million times before, and they're very good at it. So, there's a checklist, right? The technical elements are there. But there's very much adaptive elements too. Why? Because people are part of the process. And as someone said, once you introduce humans into a process, there comes complexity. And so, I'm just curious as a practitioner, how do you reconcile when you're trying to solve an issue, whatever it is, knowing that it's going to have both technical and adaptive components? How do you reconcile doing both of those and sort of working with teams in an efficient and effective way?
Just making sure. Yeah, I'm unmuted. So thanks for that question, Randall. I think that gets to the heart of the work, quite honestly. This is why some of this work is a labor of love, if you think about it that way. So personally, what I've done and continue to do is recognize explicitly the aspects that are to use Heifetz. In case people are not familiar with Ronald Heifetz and Martin Linsky's work around adaptive leadership, they sort of break the challenges we see in the world into like three buckets. Technical challenges are challenges for which there is a known solution and an expert. As long as an expert's available, you can get to the solution quickly. Adaptive challenges are challenges for which there is really no known solution. No expert can provide you an answer. You have to kind of work through it. It often requires paradigm shifts and things like that. And then a technical adaptive challenge is one that combines both of those things. And in reality, most of the challenges we face in our orgs a number of them are of that type. So I think, in the interest of time, and I can give a longer answer at the end, I think it's always important just to make sure that we're very clear on what aspect is influencing what. Like if you're trying to make a technical challenge that really depends on people changing a paradigm shift, then you need to really start with the adaptive side of the house and get people there. If the two things can be cleanly separated, which is rarely the case in my experience, then you can go ahead with a technical change. But as long as it's an adaptive change, then there's going to be some work that needs to be done to make that happen. And I might have some slides that talk a little bit about that. So that's my short answer. Probably take two hands more in the interest of time. I'll give quick answers and then we'll move along.
Okay, Bernard was next.
Yeah, thank you. Your talk resonated very much with me. And I was thinking, although I have an external, consultant, trainer, coach role, you have an internal and a senior internal role, but I still, from your talking, have the impression you cannot constrict people to listen to you. You have to convince them. And the experience I have is that when people talk about their challenges and problems, we can connect them to complexity. We can realize, that they have to do with complexity, but they would not accept that label. They would say, no, we don't have a problem with complexity. We have a problem with the stability of our supply chain, or we have a problem with culture, or whatever it is. And so, in a way, the first issue is to let them, to make them listen to you and to make them allow for that connection, that complexity thinking could actually be part of the solution or part of a benefit that corresponds to their needs. And it's kind of missionary work that you have to do before doing the actual work. And I was wondering whether you face that situation, having this senior role within the organization, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, so I do face that situation. I think the senior role affords you the ability to command people to do things in certain contexts, but we all know, like for complex situations, that doesn't work, period. So you are just generally in a position where you're going to have to influence and bring people along. And then I work in a large organization with over 70,000 people. I have to work with people who are not in my reporting structure. I have to work with my peers. I have to work with superiors. So even though one might suggest I have a senior role, and I do, there's still a ton of convincing and bringing people along that have no reason to adopt this thinking. And I could not coerce, if that's even an option, them to do this thinking. So I agree with you about the missionary work. And part of this talk, we'll talk about some of the things I've found have helped me with having people say, look at the problem differently, change the way they think about things. Thanks for that question. Last question, then we move along.
Okay, one more. I think Kyle was next. I'm trying to go in the order that the little hands appear on the screen. So
No,
to those of you that didn't get a shot this time around, hold your questions. We'll be circling back later.
Shasta was up next. Go ahead.
Mine wasn't really a question. It was just more because you were talking about dialogue of just resonating with the complexity, thinking for all, because we're living and working in these systems, even if we're unaware of even the term of complexity thinking. And that an example of that is just if people really may have bumped up against it for the first time with the pandemic, when suddenly like these complex systems that we just had like working around us all the time, getting us to work and whatnot, just kind of had to change. And that's how like we're like became aware of like, oh yeah, I'm in this complex system. So just resonated with me.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing. So since yours was short, Kyle, how about you go ahead and make your comment or share?
Somebody is vacuuming right behind me. I'll let Barry jump in. She's got missed something.
I missed that completely. I'm sorry.
Someone is vacuuming and he doesn't want to, yeah. So we'll circle back to Kyle when the vacuuming is over. We did have one more hand up, which was Carrie.
Carrie,
So
go ahead.
Carrie, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, actually. I know I said I would talk today. This is probably the one I can speak coherently on. So I think how you maybe bridge that gap of technical adaptability throughout the organization is maybe through that process of helping those people that are local to you begin to see that as you guys experience things together. So for example, with my team, we talk about the things that they want to do. We talk about, what is our current measure of what is? We talk about it. And then we think about, okay, well, are there any misconceptions we are aware of in each other's thinking on that? And also, like, what are those things that could help us? And what are those things that could work against us? That I think all of us probably do at the start. But the exploration of, okay, now how do you get to where you're trying to go? We know, like, at a certain level that there are any number of possibilities that you can take. But it is very rare that people think to move outside of the set paths that we have. So I kind of look at what you're saying as, I read the other day, someone referred to this as like host leadership, which I thought was interesting, being that network theory is like underlying so much of complexity science, right? So I kind of looked at that as sort of creating windows in the box for people to see outside of. And I've really seen people be able to connect their own like consideration of what could I do, then do it to see the outcome that they thought they could potentially achieve actually happen, right? And we've been able to talk about that on a multitude of levels. Like an example I would give you is somebody who might not be the first opinion to take over a job. And what do you have to do to be that person in that other person's mind, though, right? So you have to show them in action. So what are those actions that you could do? And in discussing those things and in empowering people to identify them, encourage them that they are able to do the thing, right? We don't often think about the people that we aspire to be like, or the position we are trying to get to, that it's not as far from us as we sort of think it is. And so I think connecting those things really does help. And I think also the people around us, seeing them talk about it and how they got there, as well as being like the visibility they created for themselves, it creates an amplification effect, right? And instead of thinking about the obvious, like we cannot predict anything, we cannot control it, right? And we cannot be certain really of anything past this very moment. We know that. But we can game the probabilities and kind of consider probability amplitudes as far as like if we influence those nonlinear dynamics that are often left unchecked, we can eliminate the potential in some cases for those things to work against us, which then allows us to get more trajectory towards where we are trying to go. So I'm going to leave it at that, but that's just my general thought on it.
Thank you. So I saw the comment about convincing, and I'll get back to that because the English language is a very interesting language, and the way we talk about things is very interesting as well. But ultimately, we all change our minds by ourselves. So maybe I'll just address it right now. And the most anyone can do is probe, prod, challenge, cause people to really reflect, and then cause them to decide. So we say convince as a little bit, again, of this notion of we cause the person to change their mind, if you will. But I think what I'm really getting at when I say convince is put all the evidence in front of a person that helps them potentially change their mind. So let's move of resistance and response. And thanks again for that dialogue. So how do people respond when you bring up complexity? Just curious for people to share this in the chat. When you bring up complexity directly or a concept related to complexity, I think Marat had mentioned bringing it up and people saying, no, it's not complexity. It's a supply chain. It's something else. Imagine there's some answers going in there. I guess I can see from the chat. Oh, buzzword.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we have all our old favorites here, Eb.
We shall simplify it. We tried that. We tried that in our last place. Okay. Communicate. Complexity is the enemy. Yeah. Freaking out and crumbling their competence. I'll have to. I'd love to get this chat. This would be great for a future slide someday. So I recently asked this question on LinkedIn, and the sizes of the shapes sort of give you a sense of the number of answers that kind of came back. And I've abbreviated to protect the innocent. I haven't put exact quotes here because some of you might recognize the quotes and be like, I know who said that. But overwhelmingly negative. Overwhelmingly negative, doesn't resonate. And so our language is a challenge. It has nothing, it's not our fault, but it is the reality that some people don't want to have the conversation about complexity or use that word or have it bring up. Or as somebody said, it is the enemy. And so instead of embracing it, as one of the earlier definitions alluded to, people are trying to eliminate it, which they can't do, by the way. But that's another conversation. So why do people resist? I think that this is important. And I've offered a number of suggestions why people resist based on my experience. Some of this is the language we use. We can be very theoretical. And here's the thing, like, we're explaining the world through a set of constructs, set of ideas. The world continues to move as it moves. We continue to act in and on the world in a particular way. And we use the language of complexity to explain what's going on. But whether people know the language or not, people are going to do what they know to do. And so what you're really trying to potentially do is have people change what they do. And when they see the world differently, that might encourage them to change what they do as well. But here are a couple of things that I found in organizational life. Sometimes people just believe that they see the world as it exactly is. That's a big philosophical conversation. We won't get into that today. But that's one of the reasons I've seen people in positions of authority, and I'm one of those people, don't like not knowing or not having the answers. I've been in meetings before where I've asked people for their thoughts on how we can move forward, and I've gotten literal feedback that said, and I recognize this is a complex situation, that said, you should be telling us what to do. Literal feedback. And I got feedback that even got escalated to my own boss that said, look, Eb asks us too many times to get involved in solving the problem. We just expect him to give us directions on how to move forward. So often leaders are blamed for not encouraging complexity thinking, but it's not just the leader's fault. If I can use the leader-follower language here for a moment, there are a number of followers who don't want to have to deal with complexity. They just want life to be simple and straightforward, at least in the workplace. I can deal with complexity when I get home in my private life, but when I come to work, I just want to know what to do and how to do it. There's a category of persons that is in that space. So these are reasons why people may often resist, but because they resist, as someone has said, resistance is a response, and it's a resource as well. It tells us what we can focus on and where we can go. And so I always say to myself, how can we make complexity thinking become something that we say it's gone viral, right? Everyone's adopting it. Everyone's thinking about this in the org, especially when it happens to be that most organizations are extremely busy places. Like people are not sitting and twiddling their thumbs and just having a grand merry time. People are working, priorities are shifting. You might suggest that many organizations might actually be more chaotic, not in a chaos theory sense, but just in the general English language sense. They may be more chaotic than they even are complex in certain aspects because things just are in flux. Gareth Morgan's metaphors for the organization, he talks about flux being one of those metaphors. And I often think that it's a very good metaphor because it speaks to how in many organizations, like things are just never remotely stable, never near order, just always this, that, and the other thing. So how do we encourage complexity thinking when this is the situation we find ourselves? So I want to pause and just talk a little bit about authority here, because this came up even in one of the comments about being in a position in the organization. Now, there are different ways to think about and reason about authority. But again, this is actually borrowing from Heifetz again. Formal authority and informal authority are two ways I like to think about authority. And there's formal authority, which is based on your organizational position. The organization has conferred on you the rights to do X, Y, Z, to hire, to fire, to make that decision, to approve that expense, whatever the case may be. If you lost that position today, if you were demoted or moved into another position, the authority doesn't travel with you. It stays with the position. So the position itself is what gives the authority. But then there's informal authority, which emerges from trust, respect, belief, where people have come to know you, they come to appreciate what you bring and what you offer and how you work and how you go about doing things. And so they grant you the authority. And so when it comes to authority, there's always a grantor and there's a receiver. You cannot, in a sense, demand that people give you authority. They have to choose to give you authority. Even when it comes to formal authority, if your boss asks you something to do that you don't want to do, you may deny them in that situation the authority they believe they have. But nonetheless, informal authority is extremely important. And so as we talk going forward, a lot of what I'm going to say is based on this foundation of informal authority and what that looks like for you in the organization. Now, because of time, we're not going to dialogue, but I want you to think about how you expand your informal authority in your organization. Again, this is not a laundry list, but I think it's an important list to think about. First of all, whatever formal authority you do have, use it wisely. Use it wisely. Don't jeopardize your relationships with people through the use of your formal authority. Expand your social network by developing new relationships. So I've worked with a lot of people who want to influence but don't want to create relationships. They just think people should change their mind because they said it's so. Well, that's not how life really works. People are more receptive to you when they know who you are. It's the Maya Angelou things, right? About knowing that you care for somebody else. When it comes to complexity, establish yourself as somebody people can go to for help. I think it's important to also know your organization. Political savviness matters. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we go along. And then practice empathy and humility. And Jocko and I were talking a little bit about this before we started. Too often we forget the journey we've been on. Like nobody was born necessarily, and there might be exceptions on this call, with complexity thinking burned into their mind. Like you, even if you are acting in a certain way, the formal thought or body of work that is complexity thinking is something you picked up. You read a book, you heard somebody speak, you joined the lounge, and now you think a certain way and act a certain way. So we must appreciate that people are on their own individual journey and that they are not where we are at this particular time doesn't mean we should look down on them or be condescending. We should actually be open to working with them and helping them to come along. And so what I find one of the biggest things as I talk to people who want to help others adopt complexity thinking in their org or in their social context, whatever it may be, is a lack of empathy and humility. It's like they just don't get it. How can they be so silly? And we forget that maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago, you didn't get it, or whatever your history is, you didn't get it. And so we all come to these points at this time. So at different times, excuse me. So expanding your informal authority, I believe, is so key and important because when people see you as somebody they can follow, they can listen to, they can value, regardless of the organizational relationship. And you can expand your informal authority with people hire or your employer. If you're an external consultant and you're hired, you can expand your formal authority, enhance your informal authority. You can enhance it with your peers. You can enhance it with people who are in different departments who generally don't have to listen to what you say, but find you to be somebody that has a lot of useful things to say. So they're more motivated to take what you say seriously. So with that said, I want to just kind of get to the crux of this, which is helping others embrace complexity thinking. And this is not an exhaustive list. As a bit of a, again, somebody who likes to share my experience with others, I've picked and shared a couple of key things that I've found very, very helpful. And some of these things may or may not be work in your context. You can decide what you want to do, which ones to use. And you'll also notice that some of these things, to my earlier comment about act our way into new thinking over thinking our way into new acting, you'll notice that some of these things are all about behaviors. How do we help people through the act of practice embrace complexity thinking without even knowing they're embracing complexity thinking? But some of these things are also about how do we begin to challenge people's just thinking, because sometimes we sometimes our thinking, our current thinking, is challenged with new thoughts, and we say to ourselves, oh, that sounds very interesting, I'm going to start acting differently. So even though we may be more likely to behave our way into new thinking, it is not the case that we never act or think our way into new behavior. So with that, I just also want to point out that this in of itself is complex work, and we can't lose sight of that. So if you're going to create a program, and this is how I'm going to make sure complexity thinking goes viral and almost set the plan, and this is the way it's going to play out, you've sort of maybe exhibited an opportunity for your own growth as well. As Iris Murdoch, who's one of my favorite philosophers, complexity theorists, says, our actions are like ships which we may watch set out to sea and not know when or with what cargo they will return to port. So even as you're going on this journey or trying to spread complexity thinking in your org, you must do so with tremendous humility. You must try things and know that some things will work and some things will not work as well. Coming up with a firm plan that says, I will do all these things, and 12 months from now, this is where we'll be, is probably foolhardy. It's not to suggest that you can't come up with some structure or some approach, but you'll even evolve and change that approach as you go away. So this, what we're talking about in of itself, is also complex. And so it's important to see it that way. This is not a, if to borrow from Knevin, this is not a complicated or clear type of situation. It's a messy situation that requires time, requires patience. So let's talk about the number of things. So establish a community of practice. And this is something we kind of do a lot at Cox. Community of practices have their pros and their cons. And you might suggest that the Complexity Lounge is an example of a community of practice. It probably is. But these are learning partnerships where people share concern for passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. So it's bringing people, the general definition of a community of practice. And in this case, it'll be a community of practice around complexity thinking and bringing people into a safe space where they can share, discuss, work together, think about doing things in a different way. So how do you establish this in case you've never established one? You know, pick a subject like complexity thinking, find interested team members, establish a structure, learn to get together and equip people to act differently. And I'll just highlight the find interested team members and say that it's important to find people who are interested, but you also want to be thoughtful about who these people are as well. You want to find people that you also believe can be influencers in whatever scope you're really trying to influence. So be thoughtful about it. It's not to say don't let anybody in, but you may want to go and approach somebody and say, hey, somebody of influence, and say, look, I know you're passionate about new topics. We're starting a community of practice around complexity thinking. Would you like to join? Encourage that person. Personal invitations almost always the best. And see if you can get people who are not just interested, but who are influencers in the community of practice. And so what types of things should you do in the community of practice? You should have structured learning events where you talk about different topics, again, similar to what's going on here today. You can definitely play games. There are some complexity games we can use to help people appreciate complexity. You can have people bring their challenges to the COP so that they can be discussed and people can give them suggestions or ideas on how to go back into the organization and address or tackle those challenges. But what is also very important is that you want to make sure that people come back to the COP with learnings and reports on what they've done, what they've tried, what worked, what didn't work. Those are things you want to make sure you establish so that people can learn from each other and can take what they pick up from the COP and go use it in their part of the organization. So creating a community of people passionate about this is important. And try to diversify that community as well. Don't have it just be senior leaders or just managers. Look for people from in all aspects of your organization, if possible, to do this. Now, COP has challenges, I'll say that. And I just listed 3 very obvious ones. It can be difficult to sustain. I talked about the fact that many organizations are busy. It often requires people who are committed to this idea of a COP. So you want to have people who are committed, who are going to find the time, regardless of what's going on. Sometimes you can have leadership power struggles where people feel like they should be in charge. And this is, again, personal experience report. You have to work through these challenges. And then sometimes, I haven't seen this as much, but sometimes you can talk about all these things and learn all these things, but then fail to make an impact in the organization because there are constraints or conditions that just make it very, very challenging for that to be the case. And so what happens is people actually become frustrated. And they're like, I'm coming to this thing all the time. I'm learning all these good things, and I can't act differently in my world, so to speak. And so that can be a challenge. It can actually lead to the death of the COP with time. So you would need to watch out for those. You'd have to really ask yourself, is this an organization where people can potentially try things, small things, not big things, but are there things we can try to make a difference in here? So COP is one way. And the power of the COP, of course, is the social network. And we all know about strong ties and weak ties, and how even weak ties can cause ideas to diffuse in an organization. So one of the most important things I tell people when it comes to basically any change, but in this case, we're talking about complexity thinking, is the power of the social network and the fact that none of us should be going it alone in our context. We should be looking for other people, for other spreaders, if you will, who can take these ideas, who have the connections, who can work in a certain way to have it spread within the org. We need to be creating interactions. We're complexity people. We know that complex systems is all about interactions. How can we change the interactions that are occurring today so that they begin to encourage and introduce complexity thinking, even if we're not talking about complexity thinking overtly? We're just acting different and behaving different and having different conversations. So how can I use my social network? Who are the people in my social network? And here's a little bit of a, I'll say, forgive me from what I'm about to say. Like, sometimes some of us who are the most knowledgeable are like, have the most hubris. And so we just want people to bow down and accept what we've said because we're the smartest one in the room. Well, that's not really how change works. And I actually find that type of approach to not be that different from many coercive forms of leadership, which is, I'm the smartest person in the room. You might not be using overt force, but you are sort of saying, like, just do it because I said so, because I know better. And so what happens is people don't invest. Some of us don't invest in growing and establishing a social network. We're like, no, I don't need that. People should just accept what I'm saying. But how ideas spread in organizations is through the social network in many cases. And so you need to understand, you need to work on your social network, you need to find new connections, you need to have them and engage them in this work of taking complexity thinking to the organization. The COP is a great way to do that. That's a formal structure, but there might be other ways that you can say, let me tap into my social network, create this community or group of people who can help spread complexity thinking in the enterprise. Another thing you can do if you're in this position is use, and I put some in parentheses here because I know, like, there's a healthy debate among practitioners on leading liberating structure. So this was sort of my quick cop out, not to get into that debate today, but to offer that there are some liberating structures that change the nature of the conversation. So if you're in a position to change the nature of the conversation, your formal and informal authority allows you to create a scope. Then you can begin to say, well, what kind of structures can I bring to bear when I have the opportunity that can cause us to ask different questions than what we normally ask. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we go along, but open space is an example of one that maybe some of us have used. Open space has its pros or cons, but there's aspects of open space technology that are very powerful when you're addressing complex problems. And so if you're in a position, I love the comment about host leadership shared a moment ago, because people talk about this in the context of liberating structures, or inviting participation is another way to think about it. How can you, when you have the opportunity to create a context for people to solve a problem that you know is complex? How can you change the context? How can you set up the structure so that people can begin to exercise their complexity thinking tools or learn those particular tools even in that particular situation? So that's another way you can begin to think about, how do I take complexity thinking into the enterprise? Asking the right questions. I love Osmer's heuristics here. Osmer is a theologian. I'm a bit of a interdisciplinary type of guy. I like to read writings from all kinds of things. But Osmer says, hey, here are the questions we should be asking, especially when we find ourselves in complex situations. And remember, everyone on this call is a person who grasps complexity. You're trying to help other people think about the world in a certain way. And so there are 4 questions: a descriptive, an interpretive, a normative, and a pragmatic. And this is how we approach the world when we're dealing with complex situations. We try to get a sense for what's going on right now, and we try to gather multiple perspectives from people. We try to explain why. Now, I will say sometimes why is not helpful. Like, it just leads to blaming. So that's a question I often put in parentheses. And you should assess the situation to know if why is helpful or not. Sometimes knowing why doesn't change anything. It might not even have lessons for you to learn, quite honestly. You have to just move on. But normative is, what do we want to be happening? Where do we want to go? From ethics or our business or whatever the case may be, where do we want to go? And then what's the next step we can do to get there? And an action plan here seems a little prescriptive, a little deterministic. I get that. But it's really, as we reinterpret it, and this is the way Osmer put it out. And I sort of reinterpret this to say, like, determining the next step we can take to move from point A to point B is what we want to do. And so establish that in order to be able to create an environment to ask these questions, you must have the informal authority if you don't have the formal authority to make this happen. But I've found in many situations where I'm not the highest ranking person in the room, if I humbly submit, like, hey, can we answer these questions for a moment here? A lot of times I get very good responses because people do want to know. People want to share their perspective on what's happening. They want to share their perspective on what should be happening and how we take further steps. And so with asking these questions, again, we're getting people to exercise the complexity thinking muscle without necessarily throwing complexity and all the kinds of terms at them. We're getting them to act differently or ask different questions by acting differently. So I'm going to skip the dialogue in the interest of time and talk about being intentional with your language. And I think this is one of the things where being intentional with our language is important. And I'm a words matter guy. Every now and then on LinkedIn, I'll end a post with the hashtag words matter because I think it's important. Like, our words are a window into our world. The way we think about the world, the way we reflect on the world is often evidenced by the words we use, And you'll be surprised how people pick up on what we're saying or not by the words we used. I have in groups planted new words innocuously and they've caught fire. I just keep using them in meetings, and then all of a sudden everybody else is using them in those meetings. And they begin to think differently about the situation because they have picked up a new word. So intentionally planting right types of words when you're trying to do things is important. For example, which word do you use, drive or steer? I work in the automotive industry and we drive all day long. We're driving this and somebody's driving that and whatever the case may be. And the implication from driving is often that there's a single person who's just making it happen. But we all know that that's not what happens in reality. And now from a complexity thinking, and you may debate me, like, steer is not that much better, but complexity thinkers often use steer as something to indicate that no one has full control of the system. So we're trying to steer it in a certain direction. So it's a little bit of a relaxed sense, at least for some people, maybe not for everybody. But the point here is less about these two words and more about the thinking behind the words you use. What words are being used in your context that reflect a deterministic, a mechanistic approach to the world? And what words can you begin to inject innocently that suggest a different viewpoint about the world? What can you do? I think those are things to think through. And what's without, again, saying liminality or basically say, or, well, Agile made self-organization popular, so I can't use that anymore. But using, those big words that we often can use to demonstrate our complexity thinking prowess or our complexity theory prowess. So steering clear of those words. I've said this several times. I have Nigerian heritage, and I'm Igbo to be specific, excuse me. And we have a saying that says proverbs are the palm oil with which words are eaten. This was written by Chinua Achebe. If you've heard, he wrote the famous book novel Things Fall Apart. Comes from, I've forgotten the person who wrote the poem, but it says the center can no longer hold, things fall apart. He's a famous Nigerian author, has left us though. And so for me, one of the things that I used to talk about complexity, and I find myself, is using like proverbs or using things that help redirect people towards what's going on. Because proverbs have a way, and you can use any other language construct that makes sense for you. But proverbs have a way, in my viewpoint, of showing like the nuance involved in what we're trying to deal with, which is often the case with complexity. So whatever language constructs or grammatical constructs you can use to help people understand we need to be thinking about this differently is important. So maybe for you, it's thinking about metaphors. And what metaphors can I use to describe this particular situation? We have a complex situation. Is it like a jazz band with people and interacting parts and basically a jazz band that came together for a quick moment and is trying to do something? Some of us use, if you're in Europe, football. Here in the States, people do say soccer, but I try to say football as much as I can. Sometimes people use sports as a metaphor for complexity. But what are the metaphors that you can use to help people begin to think about situations or think about your social context a little bit differently? Words that resonate within that context as well. Okay, you don't want to use metaphors that people cannot connect to. You want to use metaphors that people totally grasp and totally get. All right, visualize what's happening. We've been told a picture is worth 1,000 words. For me, this is one of the most powerful ways of helping people appreciate the complexity involved in the situation. And what these diagrams are of is really of little importance in this conversation. And you can actually have different diagrams. But what happens is when people talk about problems or even write it down in bullet points, they often obscure or hide the complexity with the situation. But all of a sudden, when people are asked to draw a picture, or the top left corner is kind of a poor man's version of a value stream, the bottom right corner is a little bit of a mind map. When you begin to challenge people to express what they're experiencing in pictures or visually, what happens is people often begin to see like this situation is not as simple as I might have thought in my head. And so tacitly, I've been thinking, oh, this is pretty straightforward. I actually had this happen yesterday where I worked with a group, again, a group that I have no responsibility for. They just wanted me to help them with something. And I said, well, let's draw what's going on here. And as they drew what was going on, they realized that they had not properly understood the complex nature of that particular situation and how they would have to engage differently going forward. So drawing, visualizing, pictures, these are all ways we can help people appreciate what's going on. These are all ways we can help people practice and adopt complexity thinking. Because what's going to happen from this point on, I hope, is that the next challenge they're going to face, they're not going to just jump to solutions immediately. They're going to think to themselves, oh, this is probably more involved than we think, and we need to do something about it. And so the last thing I'm going to say is seize organizational opportunity. And this is sort of the final thoughts here is I like to say that we often need to wait for the bananas to be ripe before we act. And I think one of the things that I even struggle with at times is just being impatient. I want to act right now. So if you want to eat the bananas there that are unripe, you probably have a very unpleasant experience because they're just not ready. Sometimes we just need to wait for this to happen. We just need to wait for the situation to present itself. And often it does. Sometimes it doesn't, but often it does. And so when it does, that's the time to introduce complexity thinking in a safe way, in a way that doesn't cause people to recoil. And this kind of goes back to our language, which is, we don't have to say to people, this is a complex situation explicitly. We can get with people and say, let's model this situation. And they themselves will come to understand that there's a lot going on. There's more going on than they originally anticipated. And now the question becomes, how do we act differently? How can we move things? You can even show at times that if we make a change here, here's places where we might experience things we didn't anticipate. Again, this is an example of where drawings can be beneficial and can be helpful. So seizing opportunities is extremely important. Look for those opportunities that surround you where you can introduce complexity thinking and have people take on a different approach to the way they are interacting with the world at any given time. All right, so I flew through a whole bunch of slides in a form of presentation. I actually do have one or two more slides, but now I do want to pause and get some feedback, get some thoughts, get some dialogue. And so stop sharing so that hands can go up and we can.
Well, they blew up the chat. I mean, you've all been very busy. I see that. I mean, I'm going to use the host prerogative here for a second. It was very interesting because we started with the joke about liminality. But, one of the things that we talk about all the time here at the lounge is that there are times when you use the formal nomenclature, and then there are times you don't. Here at the lounge, we love the word liminality. You're allowed to say it, Eb. But also, here, most of the people on this call know what we're talking about. And if they don't, we have the chat available for people to ask. That's why we're here. The second thing I was thinking about was, as you were speaking, was that one of the most important things as well is to recognize how the systems, not the people, the systems affect what you're trying to accomplish with complexity thinking, right? Because, I find most people understand complexity thinking intuitively. It's the systems that we have in place, the educational system, the compensation models and things like that, that sort of constrain the thinking as well. And so we're not going to be able to change those necessarily, but it is important to recognize their effect on what you're trying to accomplish.
I agree. Can I respond to that?
Oh, please.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
why I said it.
So I agree, and yet I think that's the right way to respond to these things. And yet, one of the things I see, and I just say this as a practitioner in a large organization, that it is quite possible. Let me say it this way: multiple things can be true and are often true at the same time. So there are systemic conditions out there that constrain behavior. However, what I have seen from my experience is that sometimes people are so fixated on those constraints that they miss the opportunities to act within their scope. I've seen it time and time and time and time again. This is why the liberating structure 15% solutions is actually one of my favorite liberating structures, because it never fails whenever I walk a team or group through that liberating structure on, okay, we agree. There's nothing we can do here. Let's start with that. But let's just do this exercise. Let's force grins and giggles. Let's do this exercise. And so more often than not, people are like, yeah, I can do that differently. We can make that change. And then some people who are smarter than me will say, well, Eb, that's just a local optimization. And they are right. But if it allows somebody to go home at 4 p.m., I'm fine with local optimizations all day long. If it leads to individual or group flourishing, I see nothing wrong with that. So multiple things can be true. So I don't disagree with you at all. There are often a ton of systemic factors that constrain behavior, but I've also found it to be true in a 50,000 person organization working with a bunch of teams that we can often do. In many cases, there are things we can do, but we just lost sight of that because we're so focused on what we can't do.
Yeah, it's also finding the balance, right, between the fearful thinking that constrains everything and the sort of blue sky, okay, that's not totally practical in the circumstances we're in, thinking that so it's always about finding that balance. Now, Jocko has his hand up, so I'm going to mute myself and wait to hear this.
Yeah,
Thank you, Eb.
Yeah, thanks. It's an interesting thing because I repeatedly find in organizations, particularly large organizations, that people have a greater degree of freedom to act than they think they do. And so that puts us in a tricky position because the problem with that and why people don't oftentimes exercise it is, yes, they can exercise that degree of freedom several times, but it only takes one time of going over that boundary when the hammer can come down. And that makes people very skittish to actually exercise it. So that's kind of the difference. It's not like it's open on both sides. You only got to do something, step over a line once, and you're severely hammered. Any
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
100%. And this is where I think phronesis is a very important, that's practical wisdom. I think that this is where it's very important in that people be as smart as they can be, or wise is probably a better word, to understand if this goes wrong in your context, what might the ramifications be. But no doubt there are environments where if you make a mistake or make a certain kind of mistake, the consequences can be dire.
I'll just add one last thing to that because
Yes.
also if you get a new CEO or a new boss and suddenly those constraints are very different and you don't know where they're going to settle. So there's that too.
Yeah. There's definitely that. There's a little bit of uncertainty, but how do we know if we don't probe, right? So as complexity folks, how do we know if we don't probe? So
Assuming it's safe to probe, so it's recursive in a bit.
it's
We've gone deep enough on that one.
it's turtles all the way down. Yes, it is.
Okay, well, we'll go to Kyle next, but before we do that, I just want to say thank you for mentioning Osmer. I was very excited. I thought we were going to discuss the Great Schism. But
Next time.
Kyle.
Cool, thanks. I've got too many questions here. I'm going to try and narrow it down. Like, I've also been introducing this into large organizations, led a COP on this. Like, everything you said was resonating, and I think I learned a lot more how not to do this over time and before I caught a bit of a stride. But I was in an organization that was more reactionary. And so coming in and introducing, hey, this is liberating, this is interesting, this is a different way of approaching things, didn't really catch. I was finding more wounded people that were frustrated, banging their head against the wall. They were experiencing a lot of futility. And then I could come in and actually there were a lot of people just looking for permission, for understanding that they couldn't predict this, or they couldn't commit to a certain outcome, and being able to walk into a room and even saying to very, very senior leaders, that makes perfect sense. Here's how we navigate that, was how I started to catch with a lot of senior leaders. But at some point, I started realizing that I feel like I'm like chasing the complexity ambulance, and that there's a predatory component to this. I'm wondering if any of this resonates, and like how you are selecting where you're going with this, because there were a lot of times my use cases were coming in as, this is a complex problem, and I had to look at it and say, I don't think you're there yet. You're not bruised enough. You haven't gone through the fire quite enough. If I come in and I tell you that you have to look at this in 2-week increments, you're going to tell me you need a 24-month roadmap. But you are pulling your hair out and you look miserable, and I think this is going to save the day. So how do you choose those use cases?
Yeah. So it's more art than science. To piggyback on my metaphor, is like making sure the banana is really, really ripe. But then with humility, because this is where I think what we believe and practice needs to become personal as well. Like, you will get it wrong. That's part of acting on and in a complex system. You actually, I think often practitioners say all these great things about how others cannot predict the future and things like that, but then we engage as if we can predict the future. Like, I will do this intervention and this is what's going to happen. Well, no, the same laws, if I can put that in quote, that apply to everybody else, and what we're saying around you can't predict, even there may be probability, applies to every intervention that we do, if I might use that term, and every engagement that we do. And so that's, for me, where the lessons I've learned have been to be less formal, be less strict, be less structured in a sense, which drives a lot of people nuts, by the way, because a lot of us, we want the plan, we want the sequence, it must be laid out and ordered. And I just have to point people back to, remember this plan we did? See how it didn't play out the exact way we thought it would play out? Like, that's life. Like, and by the way, what was your drive like to work the last 2 weeks? Did it go exactly as you planned? No, it did not. So you can't, be so tied to your plan as you have it. But yes, choosing between where to spend your time is important. But I also think, like, I don't know what your situation was, but this is where I think it's important, if you really want this to go viral, for it to become a thing that more people can do and approach and have, without, you don't want, in my viewpoint, you don't want to create a body or a structure that everybody runs to when we've got a complex problem, because the experts are there and the rest of us are just lost. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I believe Andrea was next. The hands are floating around on the screen, but I believe, Andrea, you're up.
So interestingly, you sometimes get called in to answer a complex problem, but they're saying, we'd like you to use this very straightforward tool. And like, we want you to, train to this complexity. And one of the structures that I've run into is the idea of blame, right? Because in a simplistic situation, you can figure out whose fault this is, and then you can go and punish that person. And so I find with complexity, one of the difficulties is coming in saying, well, it's, like trying to get them to see contribution in all the ways that they themselves are contributing to this. And this isn't just a straightforward linear, this has happened and therefore we're here. And if you could find that person and punish them and they're bad, right? Because I think one of the things that draws people into simplicity is it lets you say, this is this person's fault, and this, training or whatever will punish them enough and therefore it will be fixed. And I find that when you come in and say, well, this is a complex situation, and I do the gardening metaphor, I talk about contribution, but it feels like you are watering down responsibility and accountability, right? You're saying, well, there's all these different ways that this was produced, and coming in and just kind of wrapping people on the knuckles isn't going to fix it. And it's so you sort of get into this, oh, you're just being this fluffy consultant that won't hold people accountable. And so it's like such an interesting, when Barbara said there's structural things within a system that stops this, the desire to blame, find blame, punish somebody is kind of one of those structures or cultural ways that people get stuck in a simplistic way of thinking. I don't know if you have thoughts on how to frame that beyond, like, tried the gardening thing, tried to talk about contribution. At one point suggested everybody get coaching because they were all a toxic soup, but and eventually it kind of started to shift, but it's like, how do you talk to that, I guess? Or how
Yeah.
would you?
So, like, some situations are hopeless. Let's just accept that. Like, some situations can't be saved. They're hopeless, and you can quickly, my experience, you can quickly tell, even when I was a consultant, when a leadership team cannot deal with the ambiguity of not being able to, even if it's not blame, there is a bit of a human tendency for us to be able to explain with certainty. That's just true for every human being that I've encountered. Some of us are wiser to know when we should not be trying to do that, but we all have situations where we want to understand what happened. Tell me what happened and how this happened, and we're driving in that situation for certainty. So it's a human thing. It's only that some of us are wiser and know when that doesn't make sense. And so for companies like that, or situations, and I saw somebody what said this in the chat just as I was talking, I think there needs to be a broader conversation. The conversation around contribution and the fact that even your assessment in a complex situation could be wrong, and what are you going to do in the situation that you're wrong? Let's just even assume you're right. What happens when you're wrong, I think, is important. But I think there's a bigger question about what kind of company do we want to be? And the point on a just culture, or what that looks like, is sort of maybe a different way of having that conversation with the powers that be. Like, what company do we want to be? And maybe this isn't about complexity, quite honestly. Do we want to be a company where we blame people when things go wrong? And if the answer is yes, we want to be a company where we blame people when things go wrong, that's a conversation. But if the answer is no, we don't want to be a company where we blame people when things go wrong, what new behaviors do we need to adopt, and how do we adopt those new behaviors? And in my experience, people don't even know sometimes when they're doing some of these things, and without any checks and balances in place to say, hey, we're doing it again, we're blaming somebody, it doesn't stop. So those are like different conversations I would explore. Of course, you're right. You're right in what you're saying. It's maybe thinking about, can we have a different conversation about what we want to be? What kind of behaviors do we want to encourage or discourage? And then go from there would be my initial thoughts.
Okay, we have 4 hands up. By the way, Andrea, Fluffy Consultant is going to be my new LLC. We have 4 hands up. I think that will sort of take us to the end now. So we're going to go for Dave first because he was up first.
Yeah. So first comment, the chat blowing up like it did is a good sign of just how stimulating your conversation was. So take that as a real positive, and just thank you for that. If you run into this is something we've run into, also being with a large manufacturing company, where when you take up the complexity principles with the C-suite, you often get the reaction of, well, we understand that, but we need to simplify it for everybody else, even though everybody else seems to get it. And so it's really interesting. You get a lot of traction with, people on the floor, managers, mid-level managers, but then you get up to C-suite and they go, oh no, Connevin or complexity, it's too complex.
Yeah.
I understand it, but we got to dumb it down for others. I don't know if you run into that and what your reaction is to
that. So everybody that I work with, because this is going to be public, but they all know I'm a truth teller. So the answer to that question is yes. I have run into it, will continue to run into it. And for all my Cox colleagues who watch this, I love you all. But here's the point. I think it's important to understand the source of that resistance. And in the not to fall into the trap of being reductionist myself, right? Because again, in the interest of explaining, I can land on one thing, but there are often different reasons why people at that C-level suite are resistant. One, they just don't have the time in their mind. Spending time learning these concepts is just not valuable for them because they feel their time should be spent, quote unquote, running the business, whereas learning these concepts is part of running the business. And there's a litany of other reasons why they do this. I tend to have conversations around outcomes and what do we want to achieve and what do we want to be. And back to Osmer's heuristics, like what's happening, why is it happening, where do we want to go, and how do we go there? So I don't bring up complexity at all. I don't even bring in Kinevin because that in many cases just turns people off. There is something no, we've created a world, and I always include myself in this because I think I'm acting in either supporting one way or the other. I'm not a very big us versus them person. People, I'm part of the problem. If I'm going to be part of the solution, I'm part of the problem. We've created a world as well where it's often assumed that the higher somebody is on the organizational chart means they know more than everybody else. And sometimes bringing concepts that are foreign to people who are high up, especially when it comes internal. It's not when it comes from an outside consultant, they gobble it all up. But when it comes from an internal voice, sometimes there's a ton of resistance. How can somebody so deep in the organization know more about X than I do? I'm here and you're here. So I try to have conversations about what do we want to be, where do we want to go, and what are the things we would need to do to move in that direction and act differently. Now, of course, I have some tools in the tool bag, so I find ways to like introduce them and insert them as we go along. But that's the way I have the conversation. I rarely, if ever, start or make complexity overt, and this is just my personal approach. I care about the results.
I agree with that. I don't think I've ever brought it up directly that way either, but I've heard others. That's been a common response. And to me, that's often code for I don't want to deal with that right now.
I just ask with a question. Have they recognized what's going on as a state that needs to change? Because if
oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more around how to change it.
100%.
Right. And yeah, I would start with just, asking them about relative messiness of the situation and defining what messiness means, which is surprisingly very similar to complex.
It is similar. I just add one more comment. And there's a resistance to changing things, especially if people are going to feel a sense of loss or whatever the case may be. So this is complex work. We have to accept that what we're trying to do in of itself is complex.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you a couple of times. Did you have something else you wanted to say?
No, that's good. I mean, I can take in a lot of different directions, but there's other people in line. It'd be great to talk more later.
All right, Eb, I think this means you're gonna have to come back. Carrie, next. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Oh yeah.
I did want to say thank you also for the presentation. People like myself who are not formally trained, it is very helpful to be able to hear everyone's insight. And the presentation you shared today is the closest that I've been able to, that closest to my view personally so far. So for me, that was very helpful to see that there are practitioners who are looking at it through that same lens. Whether it's applied differently or not, I don't know. But that to me was extremely helpful. And I wanted to touch on just one thing also regarding the qualifying and also the asking LinkedIn. I don't remember the exact question you asked before, but the qualifying each other and the fostering sort of the environment to be able to get that value, right? It is hard to talk to people about these concepts. And, I have an associate's degree of arts. You would not think that I have any depth for this, but I'm also kind of an oddball whose every interest converges here in this science, right? So when I talk about it in my organization, I'm a leader, sure. I have a team, but I'm not leading a project, right? So I'm not your source of authority. So I'm operating within some other aspects of authority. And I'm also trying to convince people of the importance of applying these things, or the value, not so much importance, right? That's their choice. The value is applied to their life. And I actually don't have any problem with that one-to-one at all. Like, building referent influence with people is not difficult when you are genuine and you operate in alignment with your objectives and your shared objectives, who you are. I mean, if your words and actions are aligned, there's often not a whole lot of room for negative trajectory. So that's great. That's been awesome. But even on a personal level, when you're not describing it as complexity, when you're describing that concept of looking at a peer's insight from the years they had of perspective in one particular thing, and ignoring that because we can't qualify them as somebody who should be able to tell us that, I mean, it's really no loss to me, and I understand why that stuff happens, right? But I guess my concern with trying to continue to foster that sort of like paying attention to your peers and your neighbors' insights and the value of that is because you see how much lost opportunity there is there when we ignore those things. And also it kind of reinforces a sort of viewpoint that we cannot qualify ourselves to do things, which then is often something that prevents people from acting on things that they could otherwise do to achieve the outcome that we're after, right? So I feel like I go on about that forever, but I do want to thank everyone for giving me the space to be kind of chaotic in my speech and whatnot here. It's doing what we say we're trying to do, right? We're trying to foster these ideas across the board and share them with other people and make them meaningful as applied to life. So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like the one of our mottos should be, you're just the complexity lounge. You're not alone. Because we're all struggling with this all the time. So next up, Hazel, if you hadn't raised your hand, I was going to call you out because you were on fire in the chat. So Hazel, you're up.
Thank you. So I have a fun question, which is, and I wrote it down because words are hard. When navigating complex adaptive systems and complexity in general, in my experience, there's this learning process that happens. But even more than that, I don't know what to call it, but there's this abstraction thing where we develop new vocabulary and new mental models and a shared language to discuss, manipulate, and navigate the solution and problem spaces better. Do you, and there's kind of two questions here. Do you have a name for that abstraction thing? Because I don't really know what to call it. And then the second part is, do you have solutions for approaching learning or teaching how to nourish that culture of building the abstraction and encourage it as being part of grappling with complexity?
Thanks for that question. So no, I don't have a name for that, but now I'm curious to go for myself, go reflect on how I might describe what you're talking about, which totally resonates with me. My general approach to this has been very much let's learn as we do, and then there are just two basic groups of people who emerge. There are those who are like, and now I need to go read all the books and go to Snowden's website and I was talking with Jocko earlier and go to Michael C. Jackson's website if they've heard that and just learn all the terms and learn everything. And then there's the other group that emerges that's very much like, I will no longer see things the same way and my attitude towards the world will change, but I'm not going to get into knowing what a tag or is it. So they don't care as much about the shared language. It's almost what it is. Or the shared language around complexity is probably a fair way to say it. but they do care about developing a shared language around the type of problems we have in the organization. So instead of just being very loose and saying things are complicated or complex, they become very intentional at this point and say, this is complex, we need to solve it in a different way. Now, I haven't put a name to all of this, which is an interesting thing to reflect on, but I have seen those of the people who grasp it again. And remember, like, there are people who are like, I don't care about this, I just want to know what to do, and those people always exist. Like, when we talk about diversity, diversity has to include people who will not, quote unquote, accept what we're offering. That's part of being diverse, that's part of tolerance, that's all part of it. And so that's a little bit of a sidebar to your question, Hazel, but I don't know if I kind of gave you something to mull on, but I am going to think about the name.
Yeah, you gave me something to mull over, and I really appreciated your answer. But I think there is something beautiful in the human experience that we can all approach things from different contexts and point in something and not be able to name it, but we all go, oh yeah, we know what we're talking about there. Like it's the weird that thing. And
Yeah,
then
it is that thing, and I'm thinking about Polanyi's like tacit versus explicit knowledge, and not that that's what I would call it, but that's what I'm thinking about here. Like, if we were to talk about what it means for those who can ride bicycles, because I know not everyone rides bicycles, but that experience of riding a bicycle, if we were to talk about it, would be it'll be a little bit all over the place, but we all know what it is to ride a bicycle. So there's almost this tacit thing that evolves, and then there's an explicit aspect of it. And maybe there's some things that should be left tacit, like we just all know in our bones and doesn't need a name. I don't know, but you've given me something to reflect on and think about today.
yeah, it's I'm glad for that. It kind of reminds me of something that I think is slightly different, but a different pattern that I've noticed, which is as knowledge progresses and as we think about things, there's this compactification that happens almost like as the earth evolves and this archaeological concept happens, things get pushed down and then they get compressed and they turn into rock and then they change shape over time. And so as the idea goes, it becomes this very hard to reason about thing, and we make it easier through this quote unquote abstraction thingy. Mathematical notation is one of my favorite examples of that, because if you read the original, well, translated Isaac Newton, you cannot follow a single thing he says. There's about 3 paragraphs for what we now describe as a single formulaic equation that you can syntactically manipulate. But he goes on for about 2 chapters of how to mentally sort of grapple with the thing, because they didn't have that layers of abstraction built up.
Yeah. Wow. Fascinating. Thanks for sharing. Really appreciated that.
Yes, Hazel, you made me think, which is both a good and bad thing. But thank you for that. Kinsey, the chat has been the only thing I was talking about with the chat is that the chat has been very active in this session to the point where I can't really keep up.
I'll keep it brief because it'd be great to get into that and then just have like the open discussion we have sometimes. But we just have a 2.0, like Eb has to come back. But I was driving when my first thought came to mind, and I was going 80 miles an hour, so I decided I better not, put up my hand. But there are a few things that really resonate that are all linked together. And one I really appreciated was about words matter, because I always think about and talk to people about the language you use does make a difference. And using it when you don't quite understand it or haven't problematized it for oneself, not you, we, everyone, that really can lead to big problems. Like, decolonization is a buzzword that people often don't really know what that actually means or looks like. And I think complexity is another one. And so a conversation Kyle and I have had since we met was that, naming something can take away its power, because bringing it consciously into everyone's mind, with different understandings and that delineation of it can take away the flexibility of it and the potential of it. So in terms of when people are thinking in terms of people who feel comfortable with it, and am I smart enough? Am I in those, do I have enough background in that, to understand it, to use it. I think that's something that can be an obstacle to complexity and either trigger some, some discomfort or insecurity for leaders, or insecurities on part of people who actually are very complex thinkers, naturally so, but are not in that type of role. And so I love this idea of communities of practice, where it can be kind of built in throughout an organization or across organizations without necessarily having the attachment of hierarchy. I was just at a conference this last week where we talked about, it was ethnographic research in industry. And one of the big discourses about democratization of ethnography and research, especially in tech, and it's very controversial. And so this got me thinking of, we were talking about in the communities of practice, taking that throughout. And so democratization was the first word that came to mind, but then I thought maybe it's more about de-hierarchizing, if that's a word, so that it's about kind of getting it built in throughout the hierarchy, the power structure, but not necessarily the authority part of the power hierarchy. So that's something that I took away from this, kind of thinking about that. And the community of practice too, I have found in my work, like systems is part of it, but systemic change. And that can be especially scary. And so the idea of a community practice in an organization provides, in my mind, kind of another layer of interweaving and relationships that can provide a foundation if the systemic change and transformation happens at the more executive level and conventional structure level where the power is. If that gets imbalanced or starts to be disarticulated in a good way, then that can be really scary, especially for people in positions of power. But if there's this complex community of practice that has some kind of fabric throughout the organization, I see that as having some measure of security, so that maybe it would make transformation in the more official structure a little bit less scary for people. And that's just a speculative thing on my part. So those are just some thoughts. Community of practice and kind of allowing a space for subversivity. I don't know what the subversiveness, whatever that word would be, that liminal state, like Barbara likes so much, I think is where opportunity is. And a lot of what your talk brought up opens up those spaces where I think we can all practice and think about and find strategies. So that was great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, naming things without jumping into Foucault right now can be very interesting. It's like we just live in a world of paradox. That's all it is. And there are days where I'm just like, let's just all go to sleep and not wake up anymore, because you can talk about these things till the cows come home. I think being open to the fact that no one has all the answers, their paradox, their trade-offs. You name a thing, so it's easier to communicate, but in naming a thing, you actually reduce the thing as well, right? But then let's walk around not calling anything and see how far that gets us. So I think there's so many things that we often have to grapple with, but looking for those spaces. And as we all know, and I think sometimes we forget this, like sometimes people ask me, I've been at Cox for 10 years. And there are things I did in year one, and not everybody gets to stay in a place for 10 years. So just take this with a grain of salt. But there are things I did in year one that are just bearing fruit now. The disposition of a system changes, the characters change. Sometimes we're not in a place long enough to see any of these things, but we don't even know if the seeds we're planting will germinate down the road. So some of my thinking around this is people say, well, you don't know if this is really going to change. And I'm like, well, how do you? Like, both of us don't know. Like we know the current state of things, but you could be one CEO away from a completely different world, a completely different space, like a completely different landscape, which is why some of these things like community of practices and all these other spaces are great, because if the winds do turn in your favor, now you're already ready and running to go. So I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I just said, like, I think part of the things we all need to accept, if you're really going to do this work, I mean, part of this work is accept that it's complex, it's difficult, you can't predict what is going to happen, but you continue to do it because you love it and you believe it's the right way, and it's the thing that leads to flourishing for most of us with time.
The question that I meant to attach to that.
Yeah. You're
There's a sense that you're talking about the complexity, and there's sometimes an association of an intellectual component and accessibility, right?
100%. Yeah.
I think that it's largely like a cognitive framework, and that some people are predisposed to that. Like I tend to think that way. I don't filter, compartmentalize information, which I think makes it easier for me to kind of be resourceful, pull from different domains. And when I met Kyle, who introduced me to the Complexity Lounge and the complexity community in general, so thank you, Kyle, very much. It's because I saw him give a talk. I was like, this person has my brain, and I've never really encountered that before. And neither of us was in leadership positions, but we're both leaders, I would argue, as are most people here. So it's just kind of a thought about the cognition versus intellectual framework.
Great points. And I would offer as a reflection, as somebody who's lived in multiple cultures, I'd say there are some cultures and some societies, if I broaden it, that really we're socialized, if you will, to be reductive, to categorize everything, to not see paradox, to want a single answer. And if you have to work really hard or be fortunate or be in an environment where that was challenged all the time for you not to have that as a default way of approaching the world. And so many of us have that. But I often compare my time with Nigeria, especially with my grandparents who lived in a remote village, and sort of what life was like in that context. And it was very ambiguous, very complex. And my grandparents knew none of these terms we're talking about, but as I reflect on how they lived their lives, they approached life very much understanding the complexity that was involved in it. And their grandson, who was educated and had all these degrees, would show up every now and then trying to put everything in a box. So, I think it's fascinating. But this is why a group like this and community practices are powerful, because it gives us tools to challenge our thinking and softly challenge the thinking of others, because changing your mind can be a very difficult thing.
It's funny because I have a PhD in African studies, and it never occurred to me that maybe that plays into the different approaches my brain comes at something. So I'll have to talk to you sometime.
Yeah. I can get into the whole thing about Westerners studying Africans, but that will open a can of worms. So I will avoid that.
We can talk about that.
We're at the top of the hour. We can't open any cans of worms. Okay.
I think Hazel's hand is up, though.
All right, Hazel, if it's a short one, we can do it because we want to be respectful of Eb's time. So Hazel, thank you, Kinsey.
It is a short one. This is sort of a trick question that I like to end things with and just sneak it in the middle. So this question is, imagine we asked you a question that you were very, very excited to answer. What is that question, and what is that answer?
Who's your favorite football team? Arsenal. Go Gunners. We're winning it this year. We're winning. I see
Liverpool. It's got to be Liverpool, man.
Oh, no, we can't do this. We don't have time.
My favorite question is, what is reality? So
okay. We were saying, Jay, yes, Jay.
The answer is 42.
Yep.
All right. On that note, we are at the top of the hour, and Eb, thank you so much. This has been great, and you're welcome anytime. Can you tell us where everybody can find your work? You have a website?
I do have a website. I don't have the discipline to keep it up. The easiest way to find me is I'm on LinkedIn. I'm still a little bit active on what was known as Twitter, honestly, because I still see some posts from some really, really sharp people that I learned from. But LinkedIn and Twitter are probably the best places to find me. Over COVID, I wrote a book, so I'll just share it right here, Becoming a Leader in Product Development, if that's your thing. you can check it out. And yeah, I think I'd love to connect with as many of you on LinkedIn. Ebenezer Ikonne. There, I just had shivers now because I called myself my full name. But you know,
You're in trouble.
yeah, I am with myself.
Is this like
Internal conflict is a thing, by the way.
as long as we don't have
So
a Beetlejuice situation going on, we're okay.
for the group, I'll post all this stuff in the YouTube, our new YouTube channel, for those of you that may have missed. I'll have posts to all the links to all the ones that Eb's talking about, as well as any of the links that are showing up in the chats. So stay tuned, should be up in 2 to 3 days.
Okay. So
I
with that,
appreciate you all. Thank you. Really
thank you,
appreciate this
Eb,
opportunity.
and thanks to all of you for showing up. This is why we do this, so that we can have these kinds of great conversations. And with that, we'll see you in September. We have great guests coming up.
Bye.
Cheers.